Yep. Okay, good. Ah. Hello. Pictures are getting smaller.
Yes. Do you want to, I can try to deal with that now, or do you want to do that later? Clearing the screen a little.
No, it's fine. Oh, when I just.
Well, we can ask them to turn off the video, and it'll be much more panel-like. Or they can go to speaker view. Just if they go to speaker view.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Good evening, everyone. It's great to have you on this Zoom. I have to admit, this is the first time that I've been on other Zooms, but this is the first time we've organized one. So it's very exciting. I'm Sandy Galef, Assemblywoman, and the reason we're having a discussion about election law and reforms and what's going on during this period of time, what happened with the primary, what's going on with the general election, is because so many people have called my office or sent emails or letters just talking about these issues. So I thought this was a good opportunity for us to learn from one another and also have an opportunity to discuss, where we go in the future. Andrew Liebert in my office orchestrated all this. And so I think Andrew is going to tell us a little bit about how we're going to organize it, because after we have 3 speakers and after the speakers, there's a system in place. So Andrew, can you just give us some guidance?
Yeah, so by show of hands, folks can hear me okay? Yes? Good. Okay, so basically how we're going to do this is we're going to have Sandy give a little introduction, have a word from our speakers, and then pretty much open it up to Q&A. If you would like to leave your video on, you are more than welcome to. If you would like to turn off your video, that is fine. For the Q&A section, I have made it so that all of you are on mute. That way we kind of cut down on some of the back and forth chatter and background noise. But in order to become unmuted, if you click on the participants button down in the bottom, probably towards the middle, you should be able to raise your hand. And if you click on the raise your hand feature, I will then see it on my screen, and I will ask you to unmute, at which point you can then ask your question. I'm sure that we will be going over that again because, just in case. But that's pretty much the logistical details to get out of the way.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. And now I'm very excited that we have 3 guests with us. Catherine Borgia, who's a Westchester County Legislator and Budget Chair, and also has been co-chair of a report on the primary elections in June in Westchester County. And they had a gathering task force with some of you that are on this Zoom tonight may have participated in or sent letters to with your comments about the primary. And we have Bri Cea, who is a senior researcher for the Brennan Center for Justice, and I have a whole other things to talk about, Bri. And she has really also been very involved with the Brennan Center for Justice with the U.S. Census. So if you haven't filled out the U.S. Census, or you know neighbors that haven't, please go on 2020census.gov and let's get that done, because everybody that is counted for the census in New York, we get over $2,000 per year for you just participating, which is important. And she's also been involved with the electoral redistricting, which will come up next year. And Bri has also been a CEO and founder of Generation Vote, which aims to reach out to engage and ultimately mobilize youth to participate in our political processes. And then we have Jarret Berg, who is an attorney and a voting rights advocate, and he serves as the executive director of the New York Democratic Lawyers Council. Prior to that, he worked with one of my colleagues as the counsel with one of my assembly colleagues, Brian Kavanaugh. Also, Jarret has been a poll monitor and educated other attorneys about fighting voting rights infringements. And he has also been co-founder of Vote Early New York, an organization that helps people figure out if they're registered to vote and their options in terms of voting. And you may want to check out that website, voteearly.New York. And I'm going to start out. We had also reached out to the post office, and we think that they're going to send us some slides to talk about how they prioritize election mail. And as soon as we get that, we will send it out to all of you. We hope to have that tomorrow. And but I'd like to start just with a little overview of new legislation that we adopted in the New York State Legislature. And we have actually been very busy the last 2 years adopting legislation. We adopted last year the early voting, and the first time we did early voting was in last year's November elections. And we did it for that election because we thought it'd be better to have a test case for early voting. And I remember I did do early voting last November, and it worked very well, but we were worried if we had to do it during a presidential election, how that would work. So we did it early. Hopefully it will work well this year. We also made sure that all the polling places in New York were open from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. That's not for the early voting, but that's for the regular voting on election day. And we felt that was very important because around the state, not everybody was open from 6 to 9. We were in Westchester and Putnam, but other places they weren't. We also allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to get them engaged. I see Bri is excited, to get them engaged in the whole election process. And then we also moved legislation. So if you move within the state of New York, your registration will be automatically updated. And I remember how many people would call my office and say, oh, we just moved, so we can't vote. And that was really not fair. So we corrected that. And then after we did a lot of work last year, we had a primary this year during COVID. We had both a presidential primary and then a primary also with that. And it was complicated, that's for sure. What happened is we had a combination of the governor doing executive orders and us doing legislation, and then sometimes following up with legislation to be sure that the executive orders were in place. And we made sure with the primary that you could put down as an illness, you could put temporary illness relating to COVID-19 and get an absentee ballot. And we actually in the primary had all of the absentee ballots in our counties sent to the residents if there was a primary election going on. Now, we are not doing that for this November election, so you have to request an application for an absentee ballot. So we actually, on this whole issue of having the changes in the voting with the absentee ballots, we had so many more people. I think, I haven't seen all the numbers, but more people voted absentee than the day of the polls. It was an interesting mix that was going on. And, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in November. So because there were so many people voting absentee, obviously it took a lot longer to get the results. The results of most elections were not on election night, which usually does occur because there aren't that many absentee ballots, but this way there was. There were some issues which we learned about signing the envelope. If you did an absentee ballot, you realized you had to sign the envelope and date it. If you didn't, it wasn't going to count. We've corrected that and allowed ballots to be cured. We did some legislation in that area. Then we found out that the post office doesn't always postmark envelopes, something that we really maybe hadn't thought about. You know, when I have like taxes to be paid, I make sure I go to the post office and have them stamp it for the date. I'm now just taking them in, but you know, a lot of people found that their absentee ballots went to the Board of Elections. They didn't have a postmark, so they didn't know when they came in. We have corrected that now so that you don't have to have a postmark as long as your ballot is in up until the day after Election Day, because you would have mailed it on Election Day to have it there afterwards. So we've corrected that. And we also, you know, we've been doing this through, just so you all know, through Zoom meetings. The legislature has been meeting with Zoom. It's been fascinating. I've debated some bills on Zoom. Very interesting concept, but it was really good. And at the same time, the governor keeps doing executive orders. They're not really taken out of context, because when the governor's doing, I believe with most executive orders, he's checked with both the Assembly and the Senate so that he's not going out in a direction that we would not agree to. And he did, he recently, well, I guess I went through all those. He's asking with an executive order for the Board of Elections to redesign their envelopes to eliminate confusion about where you sign and so on. And Catherine will probably pick up on a lot of these things, because I think these are all related to the primary. And he's requiring all the Board of Elections to send mailing to voters with deadlines and instructions for getting absentee ballots. But they're not going to get their absentee ballots in the mail, the application. You're going to have to ask for that. The governor also took steps to be ready to count our votes as soon as possible. So he's really requesting additional staffing at the Board of Elections to be sure that the votes are counted, because it did take, I think in some instances, and maybe Bri might have that information from the city or Jarret, but you know, I think it was almost a month, if I remember that. It was the same way actually in Westchester with some of the races. And so he's actually, and the governor also extended the temporary illness concept to other elections. And in some of our areas, we have fire districts, or we might have a referendum, or whatever. And he's also extended that so that, you know, you can declare temporary illness. We won't have to do this in the future as long as we get a constitutional amendment voted on in 2021 that will allow us to have a no excuse absentee ballot, and then we don't have to deal with all these issues. So I'm going to start with Catherine Borgia. And Catherine, you had that wonderful panel, a task force to really look at the Westchester primary and what happened. Can you give us some of what you learned?
Sure. So we found, you know, as legislators, we had been hearing a lot of people people's issues, problems that they had with voting. You remember it came on the heels of the school board elections, which were about a month prior to what turned out to be both the local and congressional and presidential primaries all together. And people had been confused about when they received the ballots at the school district, why some of them didn't count. So there was sort of a level already of confusion and lack of information going into the primary. As you mentioned, the one shining situation that did work very well was the early voting. That worked very well both in the November 2019 elections, the first time we were able to do early voting, as well as in Westchester for the primary election. We did have two, in addition to the presidential primary, we had two congressional primaries. One of them had both a Democratic primary and a Republican primary, and one was only a Democratic primary. So a lot of Westchester County were voting in multiple primaries in addition to some of the state primaries for for state seats, and as well as a couple of other local races. So, and we had a countywide primary for DA. So it was a high stakes primary, many more races than we typically would have in a June primary. And it was very significant in Westchester County. So what we thought we'd do at the County Board of Legislators is do sort of a short-term task force, gather together a lot of information about what went wrong and what went right, as well as people's suggestions about how to make the process easier. I think because there was a lot of, I'm going to call it negative publicity around what went wrong in the county, a lot of people started to think about, okay, well, what's some of the things that we can do better? So the task force worked for about a month. We collected about, we had several hundred comments, and then we had about 70 people speak to us at our public meeting, and then we had a couple of meetings of the committees, the Budget Committee and the Public Works Committee, because those are the two committees that were intimately involved in some of the decisions that the board makes around elections. We really tried to gather together lots and lots of information. So I think there were a few really good ideas that came out of the task force report. I'm very happy that the governor, I believe, signed last week the fact that we could potentially have drop boxes around Westchester County. That was an idea that came up a lot. I also see that the New York State Board of Elections has created a portal that allows you to easily request absentee ballots. So one of the things that we found was that people didn't know the process. People are very used to voting on election day. And people didn't know the process of even some of the things that had been in place for the November 19 election, like early voting. And then, as you said, you know, it was sort of unusual times. We had a real problem with a lot of our poll workers are older people, and they were reluctant to work on election day, which I don't fault them for, because obviously you have a high exposure to people. And if they're in a age group that is more susceptible to COVID, I can understand why they wouldn't work. So we had sort of multiple problems going on during election day. The fact that people didn't have the right information, people weren't sure about whether or not their absentee ballot was going to be counted. So we wound up having a lot of people who voted on election day because they weren't sure or either they hadn't gotten their absentee ballot in time. That actually happened to someone in my family, or if they weren't sure that their absentee ballot had made it in on time, or if they had done it correctly, because most of the people who used absentee ballots for the primary had never done it before. So if you're an older person who always votes by absentee ballot, you know the process. But if you're not, and you're kind of flying by the seat of the pants, so part of the reasons why the vote took so long is because if people mailed in an absentee ballot and it had reached the Board of Elections, but they weren't sure, and so they went to early vote, one of the things that we have to do is make sure that the day of voting is what counts and not the absentee ballot, because always in-person voting invalidates any paper ballot. So one of the things we found was that there was a lot of good suggestions about communication. We were so happy to have advocates, Jarret was one of them, but also the League of Women Voters and other advocacy groups, as well as even civic organizations, who said that they would really help us to get out information about how to early vote, get out information about how you correctly fill out an absentee ballot. The instructions are a little bit confusing, and make sure that people knew that, for example, and I learned this from our last Zoom, Sandy, which I did not know before that you can actually bring your absentee ballot, or have a family member or a neighbor or a friend bring your absentee ballot to polling sites. And that is true both for early voting polling sites as well as day of polling sites. We heard a lot of people ask for multiple forms of communication so that we knew where the early voting sites were. The early voting sites got set very, very late in the process for the primary, but now they have been set for the November election. So we're publicizing that very widely. People had good suggestions about how to use technology to make sure information got out. One of the recommendations that we did make was that we do have the ability to allow people to, using technology, to check whether or not the Westchester Board of Elections has received their absentee ballot application, and whether the ballot has been sent out to them, and then whether or not the completed ballot has been returned. We think that will really, really, really give people peace of mind about the process is working. So we're really hoping that that is going to happen for the November election, although we're not certain. That is something that the Board of Elections, though, has promised us that they would look at. And we think it's really, really, really important to encourage people, unless you have a reason medically where it is not appropriate for you to come to any polling place, that people really do early voting. Early voting is the easiest and best. I did it both times that it was available. Both times I waited no longer than 10 minutes. The COVID compliance, the site that I voted at, which was in Peekskill, was extraordinary. And I think that that's really the way. And the thing that people like the best, I think, about early voting, besides the convenience factor and the fact that you can vote at any early voting site in Westchester County. So using myself as an example, if you live in Croton but work in White Plains, you can vote in White Plains during the work week. And that is a way, those votes we do get the results of those votes on election day. So that whole thing about, the many, many weeks to open and wait for all the absentee ballots to come in and to open the absentee ballots and to check against the in-person voting, all of that stuff doesn't have to happen if more people do early voting. And I really feel like early voting is going to be the wave of the future. I think you see in other states that have had it for a longer period of time, once people get used to it, it is so easy. And it really, really, really cuts down on the whole idea of, are you going to be waiting online? Are you going to be waiting outside? COVID changed the way we even use the sites for our voting. So on election day, which was a very hot day, we saw people social distance 6 feet apart, but then they were in the sun and they didn't, have water. They didn't have chairs. We can't provide chairs because of COVID compliance, because we'd have to wipe down the chair every time someone moves. So, even just the things like saying, hey, if you think you're going to vote at a time that's very popular from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., that's the most popular time to vote. So what's that's the time where people should be thinking about, okay, if I have to vote on election day from 5 to 9, what are the things I need to make that more comfortable? So we also had some questions about our system, some of the decisions that got made at the Board of Elections. But I do have to say that there's a lot of redundancies in our security. The hardest thing, in my opinion, about the accuracy and security of the elections is the fact that the absentee ballot process, especially in this primary, is a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of paper involved in that. So we need to have space, we need to have secure space, we need to have extra staff to cast all that, which is why, again, in my opinion, but I think the facts bear it out, early voting is definitely the way to go if it is medically safe for you to do that. So we had, the report is, it's quite lengthy. We put all of the comments have been made public, our written comments, as well as transcripts of our spoken comments, as well as any kind of documents that people sent to us. So I do encourage, if you're interested, to take a look at that. We do really want to make sure, though, that people feel confident about the election, because we know that we're going to have very significant voter turnout, and we want people to feel secure that their vote is going to count, because obviously enfranchisement is right of being a U.S. citizen, and people should not stay home because they think their vote will not count. That's the most significant thing. And that's why we're so glad to have all of our partners working with us to give out information so that there's a wide understanding of all the ways that you can vote in this election. So I'll stop there. I know there's going to be other people and other questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Catherine. And there are a whole bunch of questions coming in, and we'll go back to those. Some Some have been answered to some extent, but we'll return to those. Not questions. I mean, they're just, you know, chat questions. All right, now I'm going to ask Bri Cea if she would give us an overview from the Brennan Center perspective.
Oh, actually, if it's all right, Sandy, I might speak more so from the Gen Vote perspective, from my Gen Vote hat on, to talk about talk about the challenges that young people face, because I think a lot of things that Catherine brought up, you know, we heard from both within Gen Voters who work primarily on college campuses, but also from partners that work with high school students. So, you know, all of the challenges that Catherine mentioned, and also the folks that contacted you, Sandy, regarding how to vote by mail for the first time in this election. You know, imagine if you are a first-time voter and this is your first ever primary. If this is your first time ever voting as an 18-year-old, right? Or you moved to a new college campus and now you're trying to navigate all of these systems and these rule changes. Imagine how confusing it is and disheartening this primary was. So if it's all right, I'm going to probably talk a little bit about the youth perspective here. And for those of you who are young people or working with young folks, you know, maybe provide some sort of insight into solutions that we can push for to make sure that young people really turn up and turn out to vote in November. So to provide some sort of context, I think there's a lot of hype around the youth vote. We've seen tons and tons of articles about people saying that young people are going to determine this election. And I'm excited for it for sure, but I'm also cautious because I know that young people are facing, particularly college students who are voting in this election, are facing unprecedented challenges to youth get out the vote efforts. In 2018, young people we had record-breaking turnout. About 31% of young people turned out to vote, which was the biggest record we've had in decades. And this happened in red and blue states across the country. But one thing that a lot of people do not know, especially in New York, is that out of all the states that we have data in terms of youth turnout, New York State had the second to lowest youth voter turnout in the country. I think Arkansas was like last place. Youth voter turnout in New York was only 16.4% in the 2018 midterm when there was no pandemic, right? When we saw that in Generation Vote, and as a young person, I freaked out. I'm always proud to be a New Yorker, but I was not happy with that number. And so at the time of Generation Vote, we decided that we had to really step up our work around youth voting rights. And as a result of that, we partnered with the Let New York Vote Coalition, which I work closely with Jarret with, to start the Let New York Vote Youth Working Group. And with this working group, we have brought together a coalition of youth-focused organizations working with college students and high school students across New York State, and across New York City, to put together the first ever New York youth voting rights and civic engagement platform. And this was a result of a summit that we held in November of 2019, because we knew when we saw those numbers that 2020 was not going to be easy, but we did not predict a pandemic, right? So a lot of things that we have in our platform, I think, are still very relevant and address a lot of the barriers that disenfranchise young people. But I think the primary showed us that we in New York are facing other unique challenges that we need to educate young people about. And so in the upcoming election, at Generation Vote, we are particularly asking young people to step up to not only volunteer as election protection volunteers, but also, I think, which folks mentioned earlier, working as election poll workers. Because I believe in New York State, the average age of poll workers is over 55% of New York's poll workers are over the age of like 60 or something like that. And so we want to make sure that New York's elections are going to have enough people to actually run effectively and efficiently, both during early voting and on election day. And so that's the kind of two main things that we're focusing on, in addition to our broader legislative reform for youth voting rights. You know, I think in the terms of the primaries, what we saw, I'm not going to repeat all the issues that Catherine, I think, laid out really well, but just to provide some perspective from the young folks that we spoke to, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic in the spring semester brought voter registration initiatives to a standstill. I had so many students call me, so many educators, so teachers in high schools and colleges call me saying, I had all these registration drives planned, but we don't have an online voter registration system live just yet in New York. So what do we do, right? And as a result, it led a lot of folks to feel a little disheartened about, you know, registering young people to vote in the primary and in November. We also had a lot of young people, since this was their first time voting by mail, they were confused by how to fill out the application and the envelope, which I'm happy has been addressed, but that was definitely a source of confusion for folks who are new to this process. And lastly, another major issue that we saw in New York, at least, was that because at the time the New York DOE did not have an online portal to apply for absentee ballots, every county and every local DOE had different rules. Educators across the state were super confused, right? There were people in upstate New York were saying, how come in New York City they're able to have an online portal, but we can't, right? And so what we did at Generation Vote was basically put together a toolkit and resources for educators across New York State so that they can easily understand what was going on with all the executive orders, all of the rapidly changing election laws, how to work with the local board of elections to understand the application process for voting by mail in their county. And we had those resources circulated to folks who worked within CUNY, which is the city university system, SUNY Cortland, SUNY Binghamton, SUNY Albany, NYU, schools throughout Albany County and Dutchess County also received these resources. And we heard from a lot of folks that it helped, at least for the primary. And so one thing that we're definitely pushing for in the upcoming election is to also ensure that educators and school administrators in high schools and in colleges are getting the right information, because for folks who don't do this full time like us on this call, it's very confusing, right? And so anything that we can do to make their lives easier is going to enfranchise thousands of young people, we believe, throughout New York. So I can kind of go on, but I think I'll end there. And if any folks have any questions about challenges that we saw amongst young people in New York and other things that we think we can do to make sure that New York doesn't have the second to lowest youth turnout in November, I'm happy to touch upon that later in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Bri. And I remember there are a lot of groups that did, and Legal Women Voters and so on, that would go to the schools when seniors were just before they were leaving. As you said, we just lost all that opportunity. So
yeah, and it's right on. And the one thing, actually, the other thing I will mention based on Catherine's comments, I agree that early voting is definitely the way to go. And so if you are advocating for poll sites in your community, definitely think about the local colleges, community colleges, universities within your county. When we actually testified in front of the state legislature, because we pointed out that there were only a handful of early voting sites that were on college campuses. And this was before the pandemic. And so now when we have concerns about social distancing, universities and schools have ample space to ensure that voters feel safe and have enough space to not have to wait on long lines, right, at these poll sites. So one thing that we're working for is to actually push for a statewide mandate in the future for all public universities to have early voting sites and sites on election day. But until then, definitely work with your local board of elections and your local universities to see if they can accommodate a site if they don't have one already.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we're going to turn to Jarret Berg. And I hope we didn't talk about everything that you're going to talk about, Jarret. It's harder to be the last on the panel, but go for it.
Thank you for the opportunity, Assemblywoman, and for your leadership organizing this event, and also for your work in Albany on what I like to call voter access resiliency, or the many, many steps that were taken between the governor's office, the legislature, over the past 6 months to make sure that our voter access, our voting rights, keep up with the emergency. So my name is Jarret Berg. I'm the co-founder of Vote Early New York. I need to clarify, I am no longer the executive director of the Democratic Lawyers Council, but I was between 2016 and 2018. And so in that capacity, I was the voter protection director for the Democrats in New York. We participated in tons of election monitoring in Westchester. The work of NYDLC in Westchester goes back to 2005 at the latest. So our folks have been on the ground doing that work. And my work in that regard is involved not just helping to build and deploy these programs, but answering those trouble calls when they come in the run-up to Election Day or on Election Day with some of the incidents, everything from the most mundane to some of the more systemic issues that we see. So that's what informs my work. I come at this work from a human rights perspective, and so just thinking about what we've all experienced over the past 6+ months, in an emergency, historically, people's civil rights get squeezed. It's just the nature of it. It happens all over the globe. And so in a liberal democracy, the efforts and the leadership to make sure that we have resilient voter access to keep up with these restrictions are so important. And so everything from the temporary illness exception, clarifying that if COVID-19 is an illness that renders that we all have to stay out of public spaces, it is of course an illness that renders us potentially unavailable to appear on election day or to vote in person. Those little things make a major difference. The ability for every voter to access early voting. It's incredible, Assemblywoman, but when you folks did this first wave of voting reform last year, I was pretty confident that I knew what our big election education challenge would be this year coming into it. We knew all the reasons why early voting was useful and made sense as a policy reform to move us away from the single election day. But boy, did we have no idea what was coming in February and March. And let me just say, this tool in the toolkit, just to reiterate what was already said, will probably provide the most useful option for voters to figure out what makes sense for them. If folks can wear a mask and be out in public, find a quiet time to vote early, either on one of those 2 weekends or over the 60 hours plus of early voting, evening hours and all the rest. But it's a very useful tool in the toolkit, since the stuff we're talking about today is how to de-densify public spaces, to spread out that turnout pattern. And so that's a major opportunity. Folks can avoid lines entirely. If you have uncertainties about the mail, you can avoid the mail too. Voting during early voting is the same process as voting on election day. Your ballot is scanned right then and there after you mark your selection. So now what we're telling folks is the current state of play, right? There are now 3 ways to vote in New York. We're encouraging people to make a plan to vote. And what we did by building out Vote Early NY was to make sure that there was a one-stop shop from a pro-voter perspective, nonpartisan, nonprofit, where folks in New York can figure out what are my options, what are my rights, and how can I access them. And so I will just say that that sort of tool, the State Board of Elections is getting better. Their website is starting to have more of those options. But we thought this would be useful for voters. It has proved incredibly helpful to people with all these changes. So we do want to send folks there to get a look at your 3 options, figure out what's best for you and your family for voting this fall safely while still exercising your rights. It was mentioned earlier that it's not easy to change voting behavior, and that's true. It comes with challenges. You don't get to be one of these states that has majority of people voting ahead of election day just in year 1 or 2 of that program. Voting behavior changes over time. And we do see that for the states that have had early voting and vote by mail options for decades, that the majority of people use those systems, they're comfortable using it, they trust it, and they know those nuances, the things about signing the forms in certain places and the dating and stuff. And so some of those challenges are just behavioral. We need to do a better job training poll workers. Poll workers have always been required to accept absentee ballots that were turned in person, but that was such a small amount, right? It was not a mainstream option. So that obviously was never the focus of training. It was never built out. The due process around that option really was not built out and is just starting to be built out thanks to the recent legislation. But we are just sort of starting this process. It is very difficult to scale up a brand new voting option or 2 of them going into the heaviest year of the 4-year cycle. So we've seen some good progress. Some new things we'll see this fall that are improvements on the spring are a little bit more uniformity. So people did have 3 ways to vote in the spring if you were a primary voter, but for the governor to issue that order and then for that information to trickle down to 58 local boards with the partisan overlay, what does that look like? Some boards were linking to the executive order and basically saying, hey, voter, go read a whole bunch of legalese and you figure out your rights. Other boards were putting the telephone number and the online option to request right up there. Other counties were just linking to the form. So we have a bit of a tree falls in the forest problem, right? You have your rights, but if you're not told how to access them, and I think the Board of Elections in Westchester, their website is improving, but take a look tonight when we're done with this program. How many screens do you have to click through to get to the online form? Where is the phone number? It's not the number at the bottom of the page, which is the phone number for the county, but they now have the phone number listed among other options when you click absentee voting. So this stuff is improving, but what we were hoping to do statewide is make sure that there's clear language, 3 ways to vote, and here's how to access them prominently on county material on the top of the Board of Elections websites. So we're very excited about this mailer that will go out. I believe it has to go out by the 8th. That will tell people about 3 ways to vote and exactly what I just said, how to access each option with the deadlines. This is very exciting. I think I will wrap it up there. The last thing I'll just say is because early voting is new and in the spring there was so much focus on vote by mail, a lot of folks actually are unaware of this option. So we're excited. I know the Westchester plan is already up. That's plenty of time, and the Board of Legislators and the county executive will be working together, building out and supplementing the publicity effort. That's exactly the name of this game. Telling people about their options, they can figure out what's best for them, make a plan, exercise their rights. So 17 sites in Westchester County, voters may access any of them. They'll be open for 60 hours over 9 days. That includes weekends and evenings. There must be equitable siting as part of the plan. Westchester has one of the broader plans in the state at this point. I mentioned the county-wide access. I view that as a dramatic increase because up until this point, you would have had 1 option for those 9 days. Now you have 17. It is true, you can go vote in White Plains if that happens to be where you are. Vote near where you take care of grandma, vote near where you have child or elder care obligations. That is the wave of the future here. In terms of mobilization, we can do mobilization earlier than ever before. And my work now in New York is strictly nonpartisan, but it's never been easier to access the polls or a ballot. But the logistics, especially around vote by mail, are more complicated. And the overlay of the pandemic creates a new intimidation factor that just wasn't there before. So we can be texting and emailing people, click here right now to request your ballot. That's a really nice system. If folks are not comfortable with digital tools, encourage them to pick up the phone, call the Board of Elections, request that ballot. And as was mentioned before, if you can wear a mask, find a quiet time to vote over those 60 hours. So thanks again for the opportunity. Happy to answer any questions.
Jarret, we're getting so much chat here. I haven't kept up with all the chat, but one of them just recently was that that you are a co-founder of Vote Early New York. Just to highlight that. I know a couple of the issues that people are asking about, which you just talked about, Jarret, is early voting at any site. And the Board of Elections often sends out, I don't know whether maybe Catherine can respond to this, a postcard, but they kind of try to steer you, I think, to the polling site in your area. Like, for instance, in my district, Cortland and Peekskill are combined together at the Peekskill Library, Senior Center, and so on, same place. I know Catherine mentioned that because that's where she went to vote. And in Ossining and Briarcliff, they have to go to the Ossining Community Center. So it's one place. We actually also, in Putnam County, there's only one, there's not 17, there's not 2, there's just one in Carmel. There really should be one on the east side and west side, but there's only one. And then some people have gotten a little confused. We got an email the other day that somebody had voted at the school, maybe Blue Mountain School or whatever in Cortland, and that wasn't on the list. So it is confusing for people because early voting, it's not like you go to your polling place that you always go to. It's a coordinated one, which then explain again, because we had a lot of the chat.
Yeah.
Anybody can go any place. Tell us about how the machine does that.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why we have changed the technology, although this has been happening over the course of a number of years, is that when we moved to the electronic polling books as well as to machines that could handle several ballot faces, we were able to comply with, I believe it's the New York State regulation that says that you have to be able to vote in any early voting site in your county. In the first time that we ran early voting, there was a concerted effort to have people go to their local site. We had a lot of, I guess everybody on this call probably understands that the Board of Legislators and the county executive do not have direct control of the Board of Elections. They are monitored by the State Board of Elections. But we did have a lot of sort of political tussling over where those sites were going to be, because obviously every legislator wanted sites convenient for their constituency. Our recommendation was actually that they do a few more early voting sites in places where people do commute to work. So White Plains would be a perfect example, Yonkers being another example. I don't think that they are going to be able to do that for this election, but we wanted to make sure that everyone knows that they can vote in any early voting site. That is, of course, different from Election Day. On Election Day, you do have to go to your designated poll place. Some of the other confusion that I just want to mention that was that we did have to have consolidated sites, and so I was so glad to hear that there's a lot of effort, and we are doing at the county effort to get more poll workers, because we want to open as many sites as possible so that people don't have to. We usually have about 350 sites. For the primary, we only had, I think, 67 sites. And for November, we're shooting for about 250 sites. So obviously, the more sites you have, the better the voting experience and the less time you have to wait. And that's why we think with early voting, if people understand that they can go to, when they're visiting their mom, go to vote, take her to vote at the site that's close to her, that is a big convenience, in my opinion, to have 17 places in Westchester County where you can early vote. Now, you might still go to the one that's closest to you, because that might be the convenient. But to understand that, we're really trying to push that, and we're really trying to make sure the current Board of Elections communications plan does emphasize that. And we're hoping that anybody who does, anybody who does help us with communicating does also communicate that.
Right. Okay. Can I just ask Bri a little bit about young poll workers? I think you mentioned it. Can young people, they can be poll workers, right, at 17?
Yeah. So in New York State, as young as 17 years old, you can sign up to be a poll worker. If you are 17 years old, though, you need to see if your school participates in a certain program. So we recommend that young folks who are 17 years old, so if you're a minor under 18, to contact your high school administrator or principal to see if your school district participates in that program and with your local Board of Elections. But yeah, as young as 17 years old. One thing that we are interested in working on with the Let New York Vote Youth Working Group and partners across the state, not just New York City, is to understand what the training process is like for younger poll workers. And this is their first time ever, signing up to be an election worker. We know that this process can be super intimidating, and seeing if there are any youth-friendly trainings or trainings that are at least led by younger folks to make this process more inviting for folks who are doing it for the first time. And also, we want to make sure that it is clear in communications from local Board of Elections that you can work, I believe, as a poll worker with more flexible shift times than before, right? So a major concern amongst young people when it came to working as election workers was that they couldn't work all day throughout the election day because they had classes and whatnot. And so I believe it has been made more flexible in terms of folks being able to split up their shifts on election day, but it's not clear and that's not really advertised. And one reason why is because a lot of Board of Elections are concerned about the capacities with doing part-time shifts versus full-time shifts. And so we think that if you're working with young people and trying to recruit younger folks to be election workers, you should definitely communicate with your Board of Election folks to see what the capacity is and what the training programs are like, and if they are indeed friendly for folks who are doing it for the first time at a young age.
One of the questions that came up too, anybody can answer, is the county going to have, or the city, the personal protective equipment available for people that are working at the polls? I'm assuming that we are, right, Catherine? Can we let her in?
Yeah. Thank you for letting me unmute. Yes, that is definitely part of the plan to make sure that everybody who's working at the polls is safe. As I mentioned, during the early voting process, the compliance was very good. And there's a protocol that we are doing the training. Now, I will say two things, one sort of good, one sort of bad. Westchester County has not yet decided to do split shift for our poll workers. I agree with you that I think that that is a very good idea. What they're concerned about are sort of chain of custody issues. If there's too many people working at the polls, the report that we authored does recommend that they look at that for future elections. I do think it's a very good idea. That's the bad news. The good news is they have upped the price that they will pay to $350 for that day, which if I were 18 would be very attractive to me. So, we're hoping we'll still get some younger folks, because $350 goes a long way when you're a high school or college student.
Yeah, and that's such important information, Catherine, for folks to know, because it is different in every county and with whatever board of elections you're working with. And so if that's so, for example, in this case, what we would recommend is that partners like nonprofits, civic engagement groups work and pressure high school administrators and college administrators to have some sort of excusal policy. So if students are indeed taking advantage of that $350 stipend to work as a poll worker, that they won't be penalized with class assignments or tests. So, as long as we are laying as many avenues as possible for young people to work as poll workers and step up, because we really need them, especially during this pandemic.
A question came in very early on about, when the primary, we sent out the applications to vote. Why aren't we doing that for this general election, and could we do it for the general election? Jarret?
So I'll speak to that a little bit. It was a policy choice initially for the state to decide for the primary to send everyone an application form. Some of this has to do with an issue the assembly member mentioned at the beginning about a prohibition in our state constitution about everybody being able to vote absentee. So we are in the process of changing that. The governor's folks, and I think the advocacy folks around the state agreed that you could increase or expand the definition of temporary illness, but while we still have an excuse-based system on the books, which we are in the process of changing through the constitutional amendment process, we could not just blanket mail every single voter a ballot who didn't put in a request. So part of expanding the option of 3 ways to vote in the same year when you'd be rolling it out was to encourage people to avail themselves of that option, and eliminating one leg of the snail mail exchange there was the policy choice. I actually think that where we are today on that regard is a much better place. What I didn't like about that approach was we were telling people for the first time, you can now vote absentee, take no action at all, sit on your hands, and something from your Board of Elections will be snail mailed to you in a couple of weeks, which we want you to then fill out by hand and mail back, so we can then mail you a ballot by snail mail a few weeks after that you can then fill out and hopefully get back. So that is a ton of back and forth by snail mail at a time when there's uncertainty with the post office. And so what we're saying now is there's an online tool. You can fill out this request in seconds. It's incredible. It's statewide. It is now being used for the entire state. So for folks that can join a Zoom call, people who are comfortable using the internet, if you're on the digital side of the digital divide, there is now an online way to request this thing very quickly. You don't have to download, print, fill out, scan, sign, return, email a form. You can still do all that, but we do not encourage it. We encourage you to click the link that you will find now on the Westchester Board of Elections website under absentee voting, or at voteearlyny.org, all over the place. I'm sure Gen Vote is tweeting about this, as will all of our partners. The state board is now tweeting about this. So this is an incredible option. If you are not digitally inclined, we recommend that you pick up the phone and call the board. They must now take your application request over the phone. If they make any errors, those cannot be held against you, says the governor's executive order. And instead of snail mailing an application in both directions, they will now mail you a ballot. So I actually think that from a policy perspective, those two options are great. And the board is still doing a mailing, but it will tell you about all 3 ways to vote. It's not just a paper application form. So that's actually really good policy. There still is the wrinkle of whether the state will pay for stamps for these ballots. They have not decided whether or not to do that. That was a choice they made for the primary. I think it was the correct choice then. And I will not weigh in on laws that haven't been made or decisions that haven't been made, but watch that space. And so in any case, this is the state of play now. And so I don't think they've made a decision that they will not be snail mailing people an application form, but they are encouraging people that because the post office expects delays, do not wait. Request those ballots now. The post office cannot guarantee that mail will get in both directions in less than 15 days. 15 days. So even though the deadline is shorter than that, and the state did not make the deadline earlier, there is still that challenge of mail not getting places in time. So I think it's a good fail-safe that were your ballot not to arrive in either direction, you can still go vote in person, and only the in-person vote will count. That will help for people that are in that position. And I know that drop boxes came up in passing, so I will just mention that the Board of Elections absentee return boxes will be in the custody of the board bipartisan within poll sites. If it's rolled out correctly, nobody should have to stand online and go through the process of voting in person just to drop off that ballot. That is a question for local decision-making. The city is about to roll out a bunch of secure boxes. We understand they'll be by the door or the information table of the poll sites, but this is one of those things that will be decided on a county-by-county basis. I'm a little nervous about that.
Right, and other states actually have had drop boxes for a long time, like state of Washington, or mail or whatever. Can I just go back a little bit and talk, because somebody brought up the double voting vulnerabilities, and actually I think Catherine had also mentioned that, which we learned, that if you have an absentee ballot, you can drop it off at the poll site, but you can have an absentee ballot and even have sent it in, but if you want to go on election day or an early voting day and vote, you can do that, and that vote preempts your absentee ballot. Am I all correct about that?
Yeah, that is correct. So one of the questions that came up a lot on primary day, probably because people were unfamiliar with the absentee ballot process, was that they said, well, I wasn't sure whether or not my absentee ballot got in. That's a thing where we're saying we want to make sure that people have that ability to check whether or not the Board of Elections has received. So they went and voted just to make sure that their votes would count. And we had a significant amount of people who did that. And that's one of the reasons why we only get machine counts, whether it's early voting or day of voting, we only get machine counts on election night, because one of the jobs that the Board of Elections has to do is check all of the absentee ballots, make sure that that person, if that person voted on the machine and the sign-in, that's where the electronic poll books come in handy. And also having those electronic poll books makes it much easier to do this process. That their paper ballot, their absentee ballot would not count. So that's part of the process. I saw, I think earlier on, what one of the checks of people not double voting, that's the check. So I think someone else mentioned that every job in the Board of Elections has a Democratic registrant and a Republican registrant doing that job, and they check each other. But it is a labor-intensive process. Honestly, anyone who's ever run for office, who's watched them open the paper, even in a normal election that's nothing like this, it's a big, intensive job, and it takes a lot of manual effort. So I would say the vulnerability is human error, although I do think having the two people check each other reduces the ability to do human error. But one of the things we learned, and why we're so happy about the voter intent legislation, one of the things we learned is that, for example, in some of the races, ballots got discarded because they weren't done correctly. And that's really, if you know that as a voter, I think that is so discouraging that your ballot might not have counted if you didn't follow some not difficult but slightly persnickety directions. That's really a discouragement to vote. So we're really glad that that's not going to be the case anymore. So we don't feel like there is a tremendous, every system can be broken, of course, but there are a lot of redundancies in the system to make sure that we don't have double voting.
If I can just add quickly, that's entirely correct. Folks in New York, because this is now the subject of national conversation, the president is talking about this issue in real time. In New York, the first thing that happens under Article 9 of the election law, which is the canvass proceeding, the first thing is that anybody who voted in person, where then an absentee ballot also appears, the absentee ballot is put to the side and in favor of the in-person vote. So those ballots will not even be considered if the voter has actually voted in person. I think some of those safeguards, the ones dealing with postmarks and opportunity to cure, are a great first step and should save a whole bunch of ballots that previously were put in jeopardy.
Can I follow up with that? Because somebody had asked the question, why can't we count the absentee ballots before the election? That's exactly why, right? So that you don't have anybody voting twice.
Right. That is part of the reason why New York does not open those ballots on a rolling basis and start examining them. This is part of a legacy of the system we mentioned before, where if you were in your jurisdiction on election day, you were expected to vote in person, which you might not have known 2-3 weeks or months prior when you had requested. So that is something that might be reconsidered as we put in place a modern system. But folks need to know, we do not have what I would call cradle to the grave tracking system in this state, from the moment the ballot is printed or the moment the ballot is requested even to the moment it is then completed and returned through the post office. So until we have that kind of chain of custody in place, I really do like the option for the voter as a safeguard, because if I can track an Etch-a-Sketch on Amazon that I get for my child from literally the point of origin to when it arrives at my doorstep, it gives me a sense, I know where that object is. And when we have these rolling deadlines, and these deadlines are harsh, right? They're unforgivable. My ballot never showed up is not really an excuse when it comes to election deadlines. So these options are fail-safes right now, but nobody should be concerned that person is going to be able to vote twice and game this system, putting aside that it would be a very inefficient way to attempt to meddle in an election and would involve committing one or more felonies. It is not going to work because it's the structure of how we canvass ballots in this state. They're just removed before anything is open.
Can I follow up with that too? A question came through. How do we in New York purge the voters off the rolls? If somebody's passed away, somebody's moved, and so on. And then also, how do I check to be sure I'm registered to vote?
Well, I'm thrilled to yield some of this to my colleague Bri at Brennan, but I'm also happy to take the New York specific stuff. Fair enough. So for one thing, when I'm done speaking, I will post in the chat box the lookup tool where folks can quickly check their registration. It's in the signature of every email I send, and I think it's a great thing. It's just good civic hygiene right now to be checking your registration, especially if you haven't voted in recent elections. And right, we can cure those problems now, but as the deadlines start to pass, as we get to the October 9th voter registration deadline, then it gets harder to fix things. And so we do have portability thanks to the Assemblywoman and her colleagues passing that law that helps people who have recently moved, provided they were already a voter. But if you are not a voter after the registration deadline in this state, you are not a voter, you are ineligible for this election. That is still the rule. And in New York, that's still 25 days, a whopping more than 3 weeks ahead of Election Day. So check your registration status, clean up that registration, get registered, tell your friends. The question about purging. New York actually has a better process in place than many others. The language people should know here is the difference between active and inactive voters. All those voters are still registered, but If you choose not to vote for several cycles, you could be rendered inactive. That's 2 federal cycles, which would mean that you didn't vote in 16 or 18. They could render you inactive. That doesn't remove you from the rolls, but it does raise the question of, is this person still here? Are they still a voter? The other way people get rendered inactive is if the Board of Elections has reason to believe you've moved. That could happen either because a mailer that they send bounced back, or they get information from Social Security, the death registration register, or any other entity, the DMV, that you've registered somewhere else. If you decline jury duty in Westchester and assert that you are now a voter or a resident of New York City, that could trigger questions about whether or not you're still a resident and eligible to vote. None of this should remove you from the voter rolls, but it could render you inactive. And what that means is then you would vote by provisional ballot when you appear to vote on election day or during early voting. Just by voting that provisional ballot, that makes you active again, and your ballot will count, provided that you were registered and showed up at the right place. That's why it's so exciting that early voting is now county-wide, even in Westchester.
Somebody just chatted there about if you go to vote and you were on the inactive list, it just prompts you to go on the active list because you're still in the you're still on the list of registered voters, even though it's inactive. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think so. I'm not sure. Catherine?
Hang on.
All right, we got to unmute Catherine.
And I will add that it's correct that now, as a result of very recent litigation, the Board of Elections must include you in their records, even if you were inactive, so that we can figure out, where people are in real time. It's a good thing.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the reasons why we upgraded to the electronic poll books is it does give us easier access to the inactive but still registered list.
All right, let's talk a little bit questions about what ID is needed. I suppose they're talking about when you go to the polls. And who signs the witness line on the absentee ballot envelope? I think the person does, right? The answer to that is you as the voter sign. It's not a witness, it's just signing that it is your absentee ballot with the date. They match that with a signature that's on the main list for elections.
And this is a good question because it caused a lot of confusion in the spring when New Yorkers, in a more mainstream sense, were voting absentee for the first time. So if you're able to sign by yourself, mark your ballot yourself, sign your signature, and you don't have a physical impairment that prohibits you from signing, you sign yourself on the line for signature, you date the signature, you date the line that says date correctly. This is the internal envelope. And this information will be made more clear for the fall because there was so much confusion here. So the state board is in the process of redesigning that envelope. There is a separate line for witness, and that is only for folks who cannot sign on their own. And so they make a mark or whatever their mark is on their signature line, but then if a witness is involved in the process, the witness signs the witness statement. And there was a lot of confusion over that because it wasn't exactly clear or could have been clearer that that was only for folks with a physical impairment that prevents them from signing a signature that the board can compare to the exemplar. The related question about ID is that in New York State, we confirm people's identity by virtue of a signature. A prior signature example most commonly is from the DMV.
All right. Somebody questioned, are we going to enforce the mask? I hope so when people go to vote on early voting or on election day.
I mean, I'm going to say yes. I don't know that I can guarantee that every single site, but that is definitely the intention. And we certainly are working with our local municipalities to make sure that everybody is aware of that. And, that is the intention. And we also expect that there'll be a lot of social pressure, especially if people are waiting online, with someone who is unmasked. That will be would be like it would be like not bringing your bags to the grocery store. You know, you get the side eye, and people be like, "Do you need a mask?"
Do you think we're going to have? I know
think
the county has a lot of masks. Well, I don't know whether we still do, but whether they'll be provided for people that come in that
So
don't
we
have.
had a very generous donation from Haynes that we have been sending out to people in every municipality, and including, we started out with small businesses because we wanted to make sure that anybody who's doing food service had masks for all of their, but we have had a large supply, and we can get more. So that is something that I will definitely actively ask to say, hey, can we have a supply on hand in case there aren't, in case some people do come unmasked. I think that's a great idea.
And I think
Somebody asked
one thing
about.
to add.
Oh, okay, Bri.
Yeah, sorry, Sandy. I just think one thing to add in terms of a more structured social pressure. If y'all are interested in getting involved with election protection efforts, Let New York Vote, through particularly led by Common Cause New York, leads a completely nonpartisan election protection monitoring volunteer program. And so I did it, for example, this past presidential primary, where I was trained on things to look for, such as whether voters were actually wearing a mask, and if there was proper PPE at sites, and if there wasn't, I had like a lot of resources to both talk to the folks at the sites and also to contact Election Protection Network to ensure that these cases are being recorded. I luckily didn't see any of that in my county, but if you are interested in getting involved and want to help ensure that people are indeed protected when they show up to vote, Let New York Vote, Common Cause New York, and Generation Vote will be leading election protection efforts, again, with grassroots volunteers. So you can reach out to us, you can reach out to me personally, if you want to get involved. Again, completely nonpartisan, so this is not connected with the parties.
I'm having an event this next week for people to come and pick up masks and sanitizers. So if anybody wants to drop by my district office on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, we have the times, just call, and you can save them for election day if you want to. So anyway, there's a question here about counteracting voter intimidation and securing poll places. I've lived in Westchester for a long time, and I guess we've had some of it, but not a lot. Do you think that there's going to be a problem that way? Voter intimidation and making sure that poll places are secure. I tend to think in our county we've been pretty good about that.
What I will say is just strictly from a looking forward perspective.
Voter intimidation in some places. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to talk a little bit about the pandemic. Putting aside intentional efforts to make voting unpleasant, which can happen anywhere. I would say it's more likely to happen where there are close competitive contests on the ballot, because that creates the kind of incentive to gunk up the works that just doesn't exist in other places. But the pandemic itself, even if the case counts in New York remain relatively stable, is a very scary thing. Adding that public health overlay where people are being plastered on the news, wall-to-wall coverage, 35 states, 1,000 plus people. It's that stuff, especially if you add people with pre-existing conditions or who live with others in those circumstances, that is intimidating. It's been intimidating all year. Frankly, our messaging, we struggle with this. Do we want to remind people every single day that, stay healthy and vote, wash your hands and vote, wear the darn mask and vote? But it's sort of part of our DNA now. And so I do worry about that. Just since this is mostly a Westchester conversation, the drawdown on election day by reducing that footprint from, I think it was 334 sites down to 60 some odd sites, 63 or more, that represented a drawdown to below 20% of the election day footprint. On that same day, New York City deployed 95% of its poll sites. So in a world where we're trying to get people to distance, where we want everybody to use these early options, early or absentee, but they're all new. If folks wait until election day and there are lines and there's a pandemic, I don't want to wait on a line to do anything. And I love voting, but I'm not going to stand on a 6-hour line. You add the pandemic to that, I definitely worry about what happens if people feel like they're not sure what to do that day and they haven't availed themselves of those earlier options. So voter suppression does not need to be intentional to be effective. And I would be concerned with some of these new headwinds we're facing. And the good news is Assemblywoman Galef and her colleagues have created more options that really make voting more accessible than it's ever been. We need people to use those options.
I will also share that, in terms of the question of voter intimidation and suppression, I think folks are always super surprised. First off, they're very surprised when they hear that Generation Vote is starting a youth voting rights group in New York, because they say, what voter suppression or voting rights issues are you having in New York? Little do they know, right? But this is mostly before 2019. But in terms of voter intimidation, that's a major concern amongst young voters. And not a lot of folks know, not too far from Westchester, Bard County used to get into a lot of trouble when it came to shenanigans that went down with college students that wanted to vote locally, and efforts that were put in place on not the state level, on the very local level, to ensure that their votes, that making it to vote in that county wasn't as accessible for the college students there. And so, and also in Connecticut, next door, not too far from Westchester, we heard stories of young people being told, why are you here? Why are you voting this election? Go home. This isn't your home. This isn't your hometown. And that was in Connecticut, not too far from where you all are. So, that's why we think it is really important, even after 2020, to continue having young people work as election workers, because a study was done nationally that showed that young people, when they enter a poll site, feel like it doesn't reflect their communities. And as a result, it's much more intimidating. And so why would they show up and put themselves in that situation for the first time if they don't have a family member going with them, for example? So that's why we also, again, want to continue the conversation around recruiting young people in your families to work as election workers, so we can make this whole process less intimidating beyond 2020, even beyond a pandemic.
Jarret, a question just popped up, I think, from what you said about instead of 300 polling sites, they're down to 60, but I think you were talking, can you explain that a little bit further? That just popped up.
I should clarify. So
okay.
In June, the election day footprint was drawn down from, I think, their typical deployment of 334 sites down to just a few over 60. That drawdown dramatically reduced the poll site plan for the day, and that required them to consolidate. And so for folks who saw lines, and there were lines, we need to be honest about this. People in Westchester didn't finish voting until 12:30 the next morning. This is not Georgia. This is one of the wealthiest, most politically connected counties in the country. So there will be a better plan, a broader plan. I think the county legislator mentioned something more in the 200 some odd range, and that's good. That's much better. But I'm just suggesting that in any county that plans on reducing its election day plan during the biggest turnout year of the cycle, you should expect that it will be more crowded. That's the obvious result of that. So in order to compensate for that, we really need to expand these other two options and spread the typical election day density out during those 9 days, plus all the absentee voting options. So this is an opportunity.
Yeah, I think right now we are expecting between like 250 and 280. So we're not quite up to the 330. Some of the problem was that there are some sites that are no longer appropriate. For example, any place where seniors congregate or live because of the pandemic. But I think we're back to a more normal level of sites. But it was a huge deal. And I think the confusion about where to vote with the consolidated sites also really led to a lot of voter confusion. So I'm glad that we're fixing it for the general.
So let's go back to absentee ballots, because somebody emailed me that they did request an absentee ballot, but they were told by the Board of Elections that they probably won't go out until the end of September. I think that was from Westchester. I don't know about Putnam. Is that something that we should be expecting, that you don't get it right away? the turnout isn't, I mean, the turnover isn't right away. I don't know whether the county board is right now printing envelopes that have big notices on it, please sign here on the outside of the envelope. I don't know whether that's slowing it down. Do you have any idea, Catherine, whether the board?
Well, I know that they have. I mean, I know that they have engaged vendors for the printing, and they are also doing things like, silly as this sounds, purchasing envelope opening machines, because the physical act of opening an envelope takes a certain amount of time.
Right.
But I am guessing that that is probably correct. That probably ballots won't be started to mail out for at least several weeks, at least a few weeks. It's September now, so like 2 or 3 weeks is probably right.
Right. Somebody asked about the ballot placement, and I think my answer, I hope it's correct, is when there are a couple of candidates. That's more with a primary, that it's you know, you draw straws or whatever to get on the ballot with placement. But in our general election, it's the governor, whatever party the political party is, that's always line A. So now, because it's Governor Cuomo, that's a Democratic line. When George Pataki was the governor, the Republicans were the A line. Am I correct on all of that?
I thought it was the amount of people who voted on each line for the gubernatorial race. That's why Working Families line and the conservative line go up and down, but I'm not 100% sure.
Right. No, I think it's true on the other lines.
Oh, okay.
Right. But then, right, it probably would be the numbers, because whoever is governor has gotten the most votes. So.
Well, yeah, that's correct.
We don't do that in all elections, the person getting the most votes. And then there was another question about Putnam County, because I'd mentioned earlier that they have only one early voting site. And the only way I think they'll move is enough people complaining about it, which they have on the western side in the Phillipstown area, which I represent, have certainly complained about not having a site on their side, but that has not moved. It's really up to the Board of Elections, I guess, to determine those sites. So if there's somebody on from Putnam County, you just have to work on that. It's, you know, pressure, pressure, pressure. All right. Do we have any other questions? Somebody had a question about how long it's going to take the Board of Elections to count all of these absentee ballots. Well, I guess that's a gambling question, is it not? How do
there's
we
statutory, deadlines that we certainly try to make.
Right. Right, there is an electoral college that has to determine what's happening.
And in the state too. I mean, there's a
Right.
certain amount of deadlines for elections to be certified. But I anticipate, similar to what happened in the primary, that we'll be hiring people, temporary people for some parts of the job that can be done by provisional employees. Some things only can be done by Board of Elections employees. So, there's a little bit of a jiggering on that. So.
Well, there are job opportunities in all of this, new job opportunities actually for the public to be involved in.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Andrew, we had, I don't know, 64 chats, but I think they were back and forth on different things. So does anybody, can we ask if anybody can we unmute anybody who might have a question?
So if anybody has a question, if they go under the participants tab, there's an option to raise your hand, and then I will invite you to unmute, and then you may feel free to ask any questions you have.
Yeah, I don't see any yet.
Oh, Kate, I see you, Kate.
Kate, okay.
Right, give me 1 second.
Okay. Jarret, can you explain the ballot tracing for absentee ballots a little bit more? I'm not sure that I understand.
So I'll try my best. When you say tracing, you mean your ability as a voter to track your ballot?
Yes, exactly.
So, so this is all brand new. And that's my polite way of saying that New York State does not have a ballot tracking program.
But can we do it at all?
So, so the vendors that the boards work with, all of them have a way that you can track your ballot in-house. What that means in-house is the workflow, right? So your request is received by the board, and then it obviously has some system through the request is being reviewed, the right ballot is being identified, it's being printed, stuffed in an envelope, mailed out to you. And then when it comes back in, they're time stamping that. Eventually, they're looking to see whether they can ascertain the postmark, yada, yada. So the question is there a public-facing way that the voters would benefit from some of that information so that you'd know, right? Is your request received and where is it in the process? Some of these boards are starting to roll that out, but it depends on what vendor they use and is that thing ready for prime time at scale. So that is what I would call a more primitive tracking system, one that would be tied to just your ballot and the stages where it's at while it's in the possession of the board. The more robust tracking that we'd all like to see, my reference to the Etch-a-Sketch earlier, is you'd want to be able to know, has it been given to the post office for mailing out to you? Has it been delivered to your home? Or is it marked delivered but you didn't receive it? So you know something's wrong and you should take some action. My concern, since we don't have either of those systems perfected, and I think some boards will roll them out. Erie was able to do the smaller version of that by giving people a reference number. They had an online request tool in June. New York City didn't give people a reference number, although now the state board tool and the city board tool at least gives you that reference number. So you can follow up with your board and say, I have this. I will tell everyone here, I don't believe you get a confirmation email. So there is an option to print your reference number on the confirm screen. And if you go back to the city board and put in your information, the state board, sorry, and try to request again, it will bring up the fact that you've already requested a ballot. But we are just starting to build this. The states that have been voting by mail for over a decade have this built out. In places like Ohio and parts of the Midwest, you get text alerts as your ballot moves through the process. We don't have any of that here. I don't want to tell people it's going to be built in the next few weeks. We will get this all in time, but the best way you can be vigilant, save your records, follow up with your board, and don't sit on your rights. That's why I'm encouraging people to make those requests online or by phone, get those requests done and eliminate at least that snail mail option. It was mentioned earlier, we can return ballots to any poll site on election day or during early voting or to the boards of elections. That's a decent way to avoid snail mail on the back end and not have to deal with postmarks at all. So act early and be vigilant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'd like to ask Michael Mahoney if you have, we've unmuted you. Have we unmuted you?
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Sandy. Is there, Janet actually has a question.
Yeah, the payment, is the payment the same for Putnam County as Westchester County?
For the poll workers?
For the poll
I
workers?
don't believe so. I don't believe so.
Oh, it's not a state?
I don't think it's statewide now.
No, it isn't
This was a
statewide.
decision that got made locally, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
I actually think Putnam,
Come to Westchester and work.
No, I'm not.
For somebody young.
I think it was 225 maybe in Putnam. I know the city is more, yes, they're different allocations.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to everybody, all the speakers. This has been very informative. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. We have Joyce Toth?
Yes.
Toth. Hi, Joyce.
Hi. We recently had an incident in Putnam at a Black Lives Matter protest / vigil where an individual was threatening the participants, and it did not end in violence, but it was close. And I do anticipate voter intimidation in Putnam County. And I wonder what additional protections are being made there. Putnam is a completely different animal than Westchester. We're not the same county, and I'm frightened by my neighbors.
I would assume for the early voting, since it's in one location, that there's no reason that the sheriff's people can't be there on site. So maybe you should be requesting that if you think that that's a problem. At your other polling places, I don't know whether they'd be sending people out or not. Yeah, there was a concern. There was a concern. Definitely expressed. Maybe I think the main thing would be to encourage absentee ballot voting, and even if it's dropped off as opposed to put back in the mail,
Well,
that might be helpful.
there's going to be a much greater majority of antipathy because there will be many more Republicans at the polling site than Democrats if all the Democrats vote absentee. So in some ways, it actually makes it worse. So people that are really concerned about their vote counting, if they show up and there's 100 Republicans there and they're the only Democrat, there's going to be significant intimidation.
Mm-hmm. Well, people aren't supposed to know who you are when you walk in with a label on you unless, I don't know. Jarret, do you have any comment about that from?
I have a couple. The first thing is we can all recognize that our politics is increasingly balkanized, right? You see someone, they look a certain way. Increasingly, that is an indicator, whether it's gender or race, of party affiliation. But I want to get back to 3 ways to vote. In my experience, there is voter suppression, intentional and otherwise, in the Hudson Valley. It is true. It's not new, and it's tied mostly to competitive contests. I say that because what I said before, in a bright red or bright blue place where the outcome is basically preordained, there's not much skin in the game to cause problems. But getting away from the single election day is the most powerful key to all of this. There are far less opportunities to gunk up the works by doing challenge operations, which is what they used to be called, people with challenge lists. If you Google the Brooks Brothers riot, which is a Florida thing, lawyers in suits, challenging voters, tons of them, gunking up the process. It is much harder to do that across 3 ways to vote when people can be requesting their ballots right now remotely with no intimidation, and then be dealing with that, voting remotely, voting at the Board of Elections office over 9 days. So what I would say is this is part of why early voting is so useful before anybody had ever heard of COVID-19. The single election day begs for small manipulations to have outsized influence. It's a lot harder to organize that kind of thing right now. So intimidation around voting is a fact of life. This is the most powerful tool you have. That is why it's always fraught with political back and forth. But they're not going to be able to intimidate and suppress every single voter across 3 ways to vote over 9 days of early voting and 6 weeks of absentee voting. So these options really do protect your rights. Thanks for the concern. It's real.
Right. Iris, you physically raised your hand.
Yes. Okay. All right. My question is, I filled out an absentee ballot in the spring, and it said, how long do you wish to receive absentee ballots? And I said till the end of the year, the end of 2020. And so will I have to fill one out again? Will I be getting it automatically, or do I have to call them up at the Board of Elections?
All I can say is I did that also, but I just requested an absentee ballot because I don't know. I asked for it for the whole year. Yes. So does anybody else have any other advice?
I think normally you'd be okay, but I would probably just make sure. I think the request is probably in your best interest to make the second request. I know we had a lot of confusion about when the presidential primary was going to be in April, and then people requested, and then they had to do it again for the consolidated primary. So I think in normal times you'd probably be fine, but given the high stakes of this election, I probably would request again.
This is a very highly nuanced question. I appreciate it. And we don't actually think there's too many voters in the aggregate in this situation. But the state Republicans, in reaction to the primary, which was a one-sided primary, were up in arms about the idea that every registered Democrat in the state would receive an absentee ballot application with the option to mark themselves permanent absentee. And they were able to get the governor to issue an order clarifying that if you were checking temporary illness and you weren't someone who previously was on the permanent absentee list for reasons wholly unrelated to temporary illness, that your access was limited to the primary. So I would recommend, Iris, that you request a new one. I can't swear that if you took no action, one won't come, but this was the subject of the horse race back and forth between the two parties that run our boards, and they definitely did not want to give one side a leg up in the fall by giving one side more access in the spring. So it's a highly nuanced question and answer. I would request your ballot if you want one. Just do it right now.
Right. And I think we're going to end with, no, we have somebody else, but Gary, did you have a question?
Yes, thanks. If this was already answered, I apologize. I had to step away a bit during the talk. I usually would we always get a card saying my polling place, which I go to on election day. While the talk was going on, I looked and saw my polling places for where I could go that's closest to me for the early voting. Neither of those are where I normally go on election day. For election day, I get the card saying where I'm supposed to go on election day. Do I get anything for those early voting places? Do I need any ID other than my driver's license?
You don't. I do not think, Catherine, you need your driver's
Not
license.
your driver's license. It's a
No.
biometric check against your signature.
Oh, so it's a sign in just as it would be in my regular election day polling
Yes,
place?
right.
I see. Okay, great.
The
Thank you.
machines have figured out how to give you a ballot for that particular place, as opposed to another community. It's amazing what we can do with technology.
I'll tell you what, this meeting was great because I was already planning to do the mail-in ballot, but after this talk, I'm convinced to do the early voting. So thank you.
Okay, and I think we had Ellen. Did she drop her hand? Ellen Greenberg.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I just want to tell you how informative this town hall has been, and I really, can't say more, than the fact that, we're learning so much. My question is that my son, he's turning 19 in October, so this is his first time voting. And I think that he won't understand the form because we're going to go to the poll together. And I was just wondering if there's any way that he can practice filling out the form before we go.
So if what we're talking about is sample ballots,
Yeah, sample. Mm-hmm.
Voters are entitled to have access to a sample ballot ahead of time. It will be on the Westchester Board of Elections website. The League of Women Voters does a really, really good job of what's on my ballot, everything from what's a comptroller to, what is various elected officials, what do they do, and what will your ballot look like is part of that as well. So yes, you can have access to that.
So he can actually fill out a sample ballot because he doesn't write very legibly. And so I'm concerned that he may fill in the blanks wrong.
You can definitely access a sample ballot ahead of time, but that's not a live ballot.
Right.
He will have to complete a ballot like any other voter in the privacy booth, and maybe this is the point that will help in this situation and others. Any voter is entitled to have assistant voting. A person who's assisting, that's whether, literacy, language access, disability, or just because you'd like help interpreting your ballot. Obviously, in that situation, the assister is scrupulously executing the will of the voter and might have to sign the equivalent of a witness statement, but literacy and the ability to clearly fill in the ballot. The physical logistics of voting cannot be a hurdle. They are not a hurdle under the ADA and under our voting laws. So he's entitled to assistance.
At the where you fill out the ballot on the desk, you know, the individual
Yes.
privacy. Yeah.
That's right. But he should request help and say, this is my friend, my colleague, my mother, whoever, and I'd like them to help. They might ask you, the Democrat and the Republican working there might ask you to fill out a form swearing, you know, that you're just assisting, not overriding the will, but he absolutely has a right to assistance voting.
Okay. One thing I would say too, if there's a disability that he would prefer to use the accommodations, there is also a way for him to have to use those accommodations so that he doesn't have to physically fill in the circle. But I did actually learn at a recent trip to our Board of Elections warehouse that I was always worried, because I'm a little bit of a messy colorer, that if you went like a little bit out of the circle that it would nullify that. But there's actually sort of a wide amount of mark that they will take, as long as it's clear that it's a mark in the circle. So it might not be as difficult a task as you imagine. So
right. Well, my son,
but there are accommodations. If he wants accommodations, there are accommodations available. Both what Jarret was talking about, and also technological accommodations on the actual machines.
Yeah, he filled out an application. His employer didn't understand it, so I have to help him fill it out.
Right. Well, remember, this isn't writing. This is just filling in the circle.
Well, that too, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Our last question is Rhoda, I believe. I don't know. Maybe we have yes, we have another one. Okay. Rhoda?
Yes, thank you. I want to address Jarret Berg's comment on the 3 options to vote will eliminate, we won't eliminate, but will reduce any possibility of intimidation. I agree with that comment, but I don't think we can rule out the significance and seriousness of intimidation, because it has cropped up in the least expected places. I'm not an alarmist, but I want to point to Sandy Hook. I want to point to Westchester schools that have had bomb threats over the last few years. And I don't think Westchester is immune to this kind of reaction or insanity. You know, to say that we're not like Putnam County, I think is denying the reality of what Westchester has experienced with all kinds of hate crimes and so on. And I don't know who has to pay for the extra police protection, what budget that comes from, or whether the police themselves can just be assigned to double duty there. So I urge you to please consider this seriously, because again, you read about this every day in the papers, hate crimes happening in one place or another, and in many places it's in where you least expect it.
Thank you, Rhoda, for that clarification, particularly to me. Thank you. Thank you. Catherine, you got to unmute.
Sorry. You know, we have had voter intimidation in Westchester County. It definitely has happened. Jarret is right. It's typically more for close elections where there's a lot of people who have a personal interest in the outcome, less so for our presidential elections maybe. But we have seen it happen. We've definitely seen it happen, and not infrequently. You know, it's happened in various locations, but there are some places where it happens on you know, not infrequently. So typically what's happened is we have called on, the Board of Elections does call on the local municipality to assist with their police presence. Sometimes that is all that it takes, and sometimes that is not all that it takes. So we do have several organizations that have done, you know, election security, you know, to the lawyers associations, that that type of those types of organizations. And we have actually had situations where We've had to, thinking of a situation in a primary in Yonkers fairly recently, within the past 5 years, where we did have to call the county police to come in. So it's not impossible. I mean, I do think that there are systems in place, but it's not impossible that this could happen in Westchester County. And as other speakers have mentioned, it's a ratcheted up time right now. So, you know, things might get out of hand. And I do think that, you know, we do have a tendency to have good relationships with our local municipalities and, you know, alert them if we think there's going to be issues. But everyone should be ready to be able to defend people's right to vote. I mean, we know that some people are just more willing to get into it with people who are trying to intimidate them, and other people are intimidated. So, you know, we do have to make sure that that our local police departments do help us out. The county can deploy our county police officers have authority every place. They don't step on the toes of the local police departments, but if there's something happening at a level that's a county function, like elections or county functions, we definitely will step in.
All right, Melvin, the last question.
That's me?
Yes, you're unmuted. You're good.
Thank you, Sandy. I just want to follow up on Gary's question earlier. Will we this year also receive something in the mail indicating what our polling place would be, especially if there's a change?
So the governor's, I was just going to say, the governor's recent executive order is mandating that every board put out a mailer about 3 ways to vote. The deadline on that, I believe, is the 8th. So I actually saw a version of Westchester's. I don't know whether it went out today, tomorrow, or early next week, but it will discuss 3 ways to vote. It'll refer you to your Board of Elections website. It'll give you the BOE phone number. But every Westchester voter should receive a mailer in the next 5 to 10 days.
But Jarret, would it identify our mailing place? Because every year it tells us where to vote, the mailing polling place itself.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it will identify your election day polling place.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Catherine.
We just, but in one of the reports I think that Catherine got was that some people in Mount Pleasant were told to go to Mount Vernon, right? It got a little bit messed up. So
yeah, we had some errors. We had some errors. There'll be a little bit more quality control on this set of mailings.
Right. All right. As we conclude, I was just going to ask each one of our panelists if you had anything that you wanted to end with, or something that we didn't cover, if possible. I don't know that was so. Why don't we start with Jarret? Jarret, do you have any final conclusions?
I do want to encourage people to take a look at our website. We've created a map that has the 17 Westchester early voting sites. They will also be on the mailer you folks receive. But what we're trying to do is not only demystify this, but give people a tool that helps them. So if you were trying to figure out where your closest Starbucks was, that could be the one nearest to your house, or it could be the nearest one to where you're standing at that moment. I put the link in the chat earlier, but by having 17 early voting options, you can literally be standing wherever you are in the county, provided you're in a place with cellular service or Wi-Fi, and pull up the 17 sites and just see which is closest to you. So we are moving away from single location assignments, which we think really does give people more options, and that's the key to protecting rights in an emergency.
Thank you so much for being with us. Bri?
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you so much, Assemblymember Sandy, for inviting me. This is a super fascinating conversation, just listening to everyone's questions. And it's also enlightening to hear the questions that I'm getting at this town hall, or that we're getting at this town hall, very reflective and similar to the questions I'm getting from young people. So it seems like everyone across the board, no matter your age, is confused. So just wanted to share that. And I besides, being thankful for and hearing everyone's comments, a Generation Vote, we are thinking about youth voting rights even beyond November 2020. Obviously, everyone right now in the youth voting space is focused on getting out young people. So whether it be young people in your family, young people that you work with in your community groups, we are definitely happy to work with all of you. So feel free to reach out to Generation Vote. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, GenVote, or genvote.org. But for us, we think the big end game is going to be 2021, which is looking at the results of this election, seeing what's going to go down regarding the effects of voter suppression kind of efforts across the country beyond New York, and putting together a youth-friendly democracy reform agenda that really expands what we think is possible for our rights to vote as young people in the celebration of the 26th Amendment's 50th anniversary, which is in 2021. So just want to end with that and somewhat hopeful note that we have big dreams for next year and not just eyes on November 2020. And just want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Bri. And Catherine Borgia.
Yes, thank you, Sandy. This was a really interesting conversation. I was so happy to be part of it. And thank you to everyone who asked such good questions. I think the questions really show us that even people who are very well versed in this topic, there still is a lot of confusion happening. So I'm going to deputize all of you to say, please share this information with your friends, with your family, with the people who you see and talk to, or have Zoom cocktail parties with, or however you're interacting with people these days, because I do think it's really important. A lot of times we take voting as something that is we don't always take it seriously, the absolute need that we have to vote in every single election, and the absolute need to have everybody's voice heard. I would say one of the things that I've been in elected office for about 15 years, and one of the most amazing things over the past couple of years is the level of engagement on issues. And the natural outcropping of that is to have more people vote. When we see a voter participation rate that is, 70%, 80% of people voting, we know that we've done a good job. When people are not engaged and they're not voting, then things don't happen in the way that they want to see happen. When you're voting, you have so much power. You have so much power to influence what happens and how elected officials make our decisions, because it's the voters who really choose what happens in our democracy. So let's not give that away. Let's make sure that there's no cynicism in our circles. Everybody knows that they can vote. Everyone knows there's a lot of safe ways to vote. And let's just make this a really, really big voter turnout, starting with 2020, but continuing to 2021 and beyond, because there's a lot of work to be done in the future. So thank you, Sandy. This was a great conversation. Thank you to the other panelists and everyone who participated. Really good.
Right. I just want to thank you all. There were just wonderful questions. I hope we covered almost everything that was chatted about. If we didn't, I'm always available to talk with you. Either call the office, 914-941-1111, or email galefs at nyassembly.gov, and we'll continue the conversation, because it is all new and changing, and we don't know where we're going to be with COVID-19 by the time November comes. So I think everybody said vote early. I mean, prepare to vote in lots of different ways. So I just really want to thank you all so very much. And I saw that Jarret had a thumbs up. That's very creative. I love it. I haven't seen that on Zoom yet. So thank you all for participating, and have a good weekend ahead. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to my guests. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.